The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open with a creak, and all eyes turned as a wealthy businessman entered, his suit perfectly pressed, his shoes polished until they gleamed. Behind him walked his famous lawyer, a man known for winning impossible cases. The businessman's chin was high, his steps confident, because he believed that with money and power, no trial could harm him. The room was crowded. Journalists with cameras whispered in corners. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, waiting for a scandal. Reporters scribbled notes, sensing that today would be a story worth printing. The judge sat high on his bench, his gavel resting before him, his sharp eyes watching everything with calm authority. The businessman adjusted his tie and took his place at the defense table. His lawyer stood proudly beside him, placing a thick file of documents on the desk. The businessman leaned toward him and whispered, "We will win, won't we?" And the lawyer smirked confidently. "Of course, with me here. They don't stand a chance." The words gave the businessman courage, his heart steady, his mind sure. The opposing side sat across the room, their lawyers whispering, their papers stacked neatly. They glanced at the businessman with cold smiles, believing that his arrogance would soon crumble. The crowd shifted in their seats, the tension growing when the trial began. The prosecutor rose to his feet, his voice firm. "Your Honor, today we present evidence against the accused," he said, pointing toward the businessman. "Evidence of fraud, deception, and betrayal." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Journalists scribbled faster. Cameras clicked. The businessman only smirked, certain his lawyer would crush these accusations like insects. The prosecutor presented his first piece of evidence, a stack of papers, contracts with questionable signatures. The judge frowned as he examined them, turning to the businessman's lawyer. "What do you have to say in response?" he asked, his voice steady. The room grew silent, waiting for the defense. The lawyer, known for his silver tongue, opened his mouth, but instead of confidence, hesitation appeared. His voice cracked slightly as he said, "Your Honor, I cannot continue this case." The businessman froze, turning sharply toward him. "What do you mean?" he whispered in panic. The lawyer avoided his eyes, sweat forming on his brow. The judge raised an eyebrow. The crowd murmured. "Explain yourself," the judge ordered firmly. The lawyer swallowed hard and spoke loudly. "I am withdrawing as counsel, effective immediately." His words echoed like thunder. The entire courtroom gasped. The businessman's face turned pale, his mouth dry. "You cannot leave now," he hissed, grabbing the lawyer's sleeve. But the man pulled away coldly. "I will not defend you. Not after what I have learned," he said sharply, gathering his papers quickly. He turned to the judge and added, "Your Honor, I resign from this case." The businessman's heart pounded. The room erupted into chaos. Voices rose, reporters shouted. The lawyer abandoned him. What will he do now? The spectators leaned closer, hungry for drama. The opposing lawyers smirked, their smiles growing wider. The judge slammed his gavel, the sound echoing across the chamber. "Order," he commanded, but even his voice could not erase the shock that filled the room. The businessman stood trembling, suddenly alone at his table, his famous lawyer gone, his defense broken. His employees, sitting in the gallery, exchanged worried glances. Some lowered their eyes in shame, others whispered in fear. The man they had served for years now looked vulnerable, like a lion stripped of its claws. The businessman sank back into his chair, his hands gripping the wooden armrests tightly, his mind spinning. He had trusted money to protect him. He had trusted his lawyer to fight for him. And now, in the most important moment of his life, both had slipped away. The prosecutor smirked, leaning back in his chair, whispering to his team, "He is finished. He has no one left." The opposing lawyers chuckled quietly, their confidence rising. The businessman's enemies were ready to watch him fall, and in that heavy silence, with the cameras flashing, the crowd whispering, and the judge waiting for order, the wealthy man realized something he had never felt before. He was defenseless. His world of power and control had crumbled in front of everyone. But what no one knew, what no one expected, was that salvation would not come from money, not from power, not from another famous lawyer, but from someone sitting quietly at the back of the courtroom, someone the world never noticed, someone who was about to rise. The businessman bowed his head in despair. His enemies smiled, believing victory was already theirs. But the story had only just begun, and the shock of the lawyer leaving was only the first twist in a trial that would change everything. The courtroom still buzzed with whispers. The echo of the lawyer's words hung in the air like a curse. "I withdraw as counsel," he had said. And in that single moment, the proud businessman who had entered with his head high now sat crushed in his chair, his face pale, his hands trembling against the wooden table. The judge stared down from his seat, his eyes sharp and unblinking. "This is highly unusual," he said firmly. "Abandoning your client in the middle of a trial is not taken lightly, counsel." But the lawyer, adjusting his suit with shaking hands, replied coldly, "I cannot represent a man whose actions I cannot defend." His words were sharp, filled with disgust. Gasps filled the room again. Journalists scribbled furiously, their pens racing across paper. "Lawyer abandons millionaire in court," one whispered excitedly. "This will be the headline tomorrow." The cameras flashed again, capturing the image of the businessman alone, his once famous protector walking away without a backward glance. The businessman reached out desperately, grabbing the edge of his lawyer's sleeve. "You can't leave me, I paid you. I trusted you," he whispered harshly. But the lawyer pulled away, his eyes cold. "Some things cannot be bought, not even with all your money." And with that, he walked out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing like heavy drums. The spectators burst into murmurs, some with cruel smiles, some with pity. "He is finished," one man whispered. "Even his lawyer doesn't believe in him," another added. "All the money in the world cannot save him now." The words stung like knives. The businessman lowered his head further. On the opposite side, the prosecutor leaned back in his chair. A smug smile spreading across his face, he whispered to his colleagues, "Our work just got easier. He has no defense. No one left to fight for him." His team chuckled softly, their confidence swelling. They could already taste victory. The judge struck his gavel again, his voice cutting through the noise. Order in the court, but the whispers did not fully stop. The room had already decided, in their eyes, the trial was over. The businessman was doomed. He sat frozen, sweat dripping down his forehead, his heart pounding like a trapped animal. Never in his life had he felt powerless. He had built an empire with money, with power, with influence. People always bowed to him, always followed his orders, but here, in this room, all of that meant nothing. His fortune could not erase the betrayal he had just faced. Behind him, in the gallery, his employees sat nervously. Some lowered their heads, ashamed to be seen with him now. Others whispered among themselves, wondering if this was the end. They had worked for him, respected him, even feared him. But now he looked small, vulnerable, like a man standing in quicksand with no rope to hold on to. And yet among them sat one woman who did not look away. His maid, the one who had cleaned his house for years, who had brought him tea quietly in the evenings, who had overheard the secrets no one else noticed. Her hands gripped tightly together as she watched her employer's world collapse before her eyes, her heart beating faster. The businessman lifted his head once, his eyes scanning the courtroom, searching desperately for help, for anyone willing to step forward. His advisors avoided his gaze. His employees shifted uncomfortably. No one dared to stand. Fear of the court, fear of the press, fear of humiliation kept them silent. His enemies smirked openly now. Their lawyers prepared their next arguments. Confident the trial was already won, they whispered to each other with cruel satisfaction. He came in proud, and now look at him. The higher they climb, the harder they fall. The businessman clenched his fists under the table, anger mixing with despair. "Is this how it ends?" he thought. "Betrayed by the very man I trusted, mocked by those who envy me, abandoned by those who once bowed to me." The thought burned inside him, but he could not deny it. He was alone. The judge cleared his throat, his voice echoing. "We will adjourn briefly to allow the defendant to secure new representation," he announced. But even his tone carried doubt, as if he too believed that no one would come forward. The businessman pressed his hand against his forehead, his pride shattered. And in that moment, when defeat seemed certain, a voice inside the gallery whispered softly, almost to herself, "I will not let him fall." It was the maid, her eyes fixed on her employer, her chest rising with determination. Though she was only a servant, though she had no degree, no title, she knew truths, she had heard things, and more than anything, she had loyalty. She looked around at the crowd, at the journalists, at the sneering opponents, and though her hands trembled, her heart told her what she must do. She could not stay silent, not when the man she had served for years was being torn apart. The betrayal of the lawyer had left the businessman defenseless. It had filled the room with arrogance and mockery, but the story was not finished, because soon, against all odds, someone no one expected would rise to speak, and when she did, the courtroom that laughed at the millionaire's fall would soon fall silent again. this time in shock. The courtroom air was heavy. The sound of shuffling papers and low whispers filled the silence left behind by the lawyer's sudden betrayal. The wealthy businessman sat hunched in his chair, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His enemies smiled across from him, their confidence glowing like a flame, and the judge looked down with calm authority, waiting for order to return. Reporters in the back leaned closer, their cameras clicking, capturing every detail of his despair. "This is history," one whispered to another. The millionaire who thought money could buy everything. Abandoned in front of everyone. The crowd murmured in agreement, ready to watch him sink further. But in the gallery, behind rows of silent employees and curious spectators, one woman's heart pounded harder than all the rest. She was not dressed in fine clothes, her hands were rough from work, her eyes lined with years of fatigue. She was the housemaid, the one who had cleaned the businessman's floors, washed his dishes, and lived in the shadows of his great wealth. She had always been invisible. Staff passed her without noticing. Guests ignored her presence. Even in the businessman's mansion, she blended into the background. But now, as she watched him crumbling alone, abandoned by everyone who claimed to serve him, something inside her refused to stay silent. Her hands trembled as she clutched her worn purse. Her lips pressed together tightly. "If no one will stand for him," she thought, "then I will." The idea burned in her chest. Fear wrestled with courage. Her mind screamed that she was only a servant, only a woman who scrubbed floors. What right did she have to speak in a court full of lawyers and judges? But then she looked at him again, the man she had worked for, the man who had given her employment when no one else would, the man who had sometimes been harsh, sometimes distant, but who had always trusted her loyalty. And in his eyes she saw something she had never seen before. Desperation. The judge's gavel struck once more, calling for order. "We will continue shortly," he said, his voice steady. But before he could move further, a soft voice rose from the gallery, trembling yet clear. "Yo lo defenderé." The words cut through the noise like lightning. The room froze, dozens of heads turned sharply. Eyes wide in shock, the businessman lifted his face in disbelief, searching for the voice, and there she was, standing in the middle row, her back straight, her eyes filled with determination. Gasps filled the courtroom, followed quickly by laughter. Reporters scribbled furiously, some even laughed out loud. "Did she say that?" one whispered. "The maid will defend him." Another snorted. "This is madness." The judge's eyebrows lifted in surprise. His gavel struck again. "Silence," he commanded, then turned his sharp gaze to her. "Who are you to speak?" he asked. His tone firm. She took a deep breath, her voice steadier this time. "I am his employee. I have worked for him for years, and if no one else will defend him, then I will." The businessman's mouth fell open, his eyes wide. He shook his head slowly, whispering, "No, you don't understand. You can't." But his voice was too weak. Drowned by the crowd's reaction, the opposing lawyers smirked. One leaned toward the other and whispered loudly enough for all to hear, "A maid will argue against us. This is comedy. We don't even need to fight anymore." Their chuckles filled the air, but the woman did not lower her head. She stood taller, her hands still trembling, but her voice steady. "I may not be a lawyer, but I know the truth, and truth does not belong only to those with money or education. It belongs to anyone brave enough to speak it." The laughter in the room faltered slightly, her words cutting deeper than expected. The judge leaned back, his sharp eyes studying her, uncertain whether to dismiss her or listen. The businessman whispered again, his voice breaking. "Why are you doing this?" She turned her gaze to him, her expression firm. "Because you are alone. And even though the world mocks you, I will not let you face it without a voice." The spectators shifted uneasily. Some still chuckled, others frowned, but slowly, silence began to settle. There was something unusual in her tone, something raw, something that even the trained lawyers could not replicate. It was not arrogance. It was not performance. It was conviction. The reporters scribbled faster, their headlines already forming. "Maid defends millionaire in court. Servant takes the stand." Some shook their heads. Some grinned. But all knew this moment would spread beyond these walls. The judge's voice cut through again. Slower this time. "Very well," he said cautiously. "If you claim to defend him, you will be heard, but be warned. This is not a place for stories. This is a place for facts." His gavel struck once, sealing the moment. The businessman buried his face in his hands, torn between shame and gratitude. Never in his life had he imagined being defended not by lawyers, not by friends, but by the woman who polished his silver and swept his floors. The maid, however, stood firm, her heart pounding, her fear still present. but her determination stronger. She had spoken the words, she had claimed her place, and there was no turning back. The betrayal of the lawyer had left the millionaire defenseless, but the courage of his servant had just begun a new chapter, one that no one in that courtroom, not even the judge, could have predicted. And as she stepped forward slowly, her head high, the world that once laughed at her was about to hear her voice, a voice that would shake the very foundation of the trial. The words "Yo lo defenderé" still echoed in the courtroom, bouncing off the tall walls like an impossible dream. The maid stood trembling yet unshaken, her hands clasped together tightly, her voice still quivering from the courage it had taken to speak. But the silence that followed did not last long. It shattered quickly into loud laughter. The first chuckles came from the opposing lawyers, then from the spectators, then from reporters in the back. Soon the whole room was buzzing with cruel amusement. "A maid defending a millionaire," one man laughed, slapping his knee. "This is a circus." "Not a court," another shouted. "Bring her a broom." "Not a case." The words stabbed at her, sharp and mocking, but she did not lower her head. The judge's gavel struck hard, his voice commanding. Silence. But even he could not fully erase the smirks that lingered on people's faces. His stern eyes fixed on her. "You understand the seriousness of what you are saying?" he asked firmly. "This is not a game," she nodded slowly, her chest rising and falling quickly. "I understand, Your Honor, but I also understand that truth is not always spoken by those in fine suits." Her voice grew stronger. "Sometimes truth comes from the ones who are ignored." Gasps rippled through the room. Some smirked still, but others shifted uncomfortably. The weight of her words pressed against them. The businessman lifted his head slightly, his eyes red with shame and surprise. He whispered hoarsely, "You should not be here. They will laugh at you." But she looked at him and whispered back, "They already laugh. Let them hear why I am here." The prosecutor rose, his arms crossed, his face twisted in disbelief. "Your Honor," he said with a mocking tone, "this woman is not qualified. She is not a lawyer. She cleans floors. What does she know of the law?" His voice carried over the room. The laughter returned, but the maid stepped forward, her hands still trembling. "I may not know the books you studied, but I know what I have seen, I know what I have heard, and I know the truth." The opposing lawyer smirked. "And will you sweep the lies away with your mop?" he sneered. The crowd laughed again, but this time it was softer, less certain. The judge glared at him. "This court will not be turned into theater," he warned, and the lawyer lowered his eyes reluctantly. The maid stood straighter now, her fear still there, but hidden beneath a growing fire. "You all laugh because I am a maid," she said loudly, her voice echoing clearly. "But I have listened when others thought I was invisible. I have seen the documents left on tables. I have heard the conversations behind closed doors. And I remember every word." The laughter quieted slightly. Replaced by murmurs, the reporter scribbled faster, realizing there might be more to this than a servant's pride. The judge leaned forward, his chin resting on his hand. Intrigued despite himself, the businessman covered his face with his hand, torn between humiliation and awe. Never in his life had he thought the woman who dusted his shelves and washed his dishes would rise in his defense. Yet here she was, facing ridicule without flinching, her courage putting his wealth and power to shame. The prosecutor tried again, his voice sharp. "This is absurd, Your Honor. Shall we now allow gardeners and cooks to argue cases?" But the maid met his eyes directly. Something few ever dared. Perhaps they should. "If the truth lies with them," she said calmly. Her words simple yet sharp. They cut deeper than clever arguments. The judge raised his hand, silencing the noise. "Enough," he said, his voice stern. "This woman has spoken, and though her position is unusual, I will not dismiss her yet. This court is for truth, and truth may come from unexpected mouths." His decision sent ripples through the crowd, shock, disbelief, and even a few nods of respect. Respect. The maid inhaled deeply, her heart racing. She had survived the laughter. She had faced the mockery, and though doubt still lingered in every eye around her, she had won a small space to speak. She clutched the edge of the defense table, whispering to herself, "Hold on. Just hold on." The businessman leaned toward her, his voice low, almost breaking. "Why are you doing this? Why risk everything for me?" She turned her gaze on him, her expression firm. "Because everyone else left, but I will not. I know you are not perfect, but I also know you are not guilty of all they say. And I will prove it." The courtroom buzzed again, whispers rising like wind. Some still laughed. Others doubted. But the seed of curiosity had been planted. No one could ignore her completely anymore. The judge's gavel struck once more. "Very well," he said with finality. "You claim you can defend him, then you will be heard. But know this. If you speak lies, you will not only shame yourself, you will bear the full weight of this court." His warning was heavy, but the maid only nodded, her eyes unwavering. Laughter had tried to break her. Doubt had tried to silence her, but neither had succeeded. She stood in the center of the courtroom, no longer invisible, her voice steady, her courage undeniable, and though many still thought she would fail, a few began to wonder if perhaps she truly carried something they had not seen. And so the maid, once mocked as nothing more than a servant, prepared to step into a fight that no one believed she could win. Her heart beating fast, her mind filled with the truths she had carried quietly for years, truths that could soon turn the entire trial upside down. The courtroom had mocked her. The crowd had doubted her. But once the judge allowed her to speak, the maid knew there was no turning back. She stood tall, her hands trembling only slightly now, her eyes focused on the judge, her voice firm though her heart pounded. "You may see me as nothing more than a servant," she began, "but servants hear and see more than you think." Her words drew murmurs from the crowd. Some rolled their eyes, others leaned closer. Curious despite themselves, the prosecutor crossed his arms with a smirk, confident she would embarrass herself soon. "Go ahead then," he sneered. "Entertain us with your cleaning stories." His arrogance filled the room, but she did not falter. She stepped forward slowly, her gaze steady. "I was there the night the contracts were prepared," she said clearly. "I remember cleaning the study when the papers were laid out. I remember the voices of those who came to discuss them. I was invisible to them, so they spoke freely. But I listened." The prosecutor frowned, his smirk faltering. "Impossible," he said quickly. "Those meetings were private." But she nodded. "Private, yes, but not silent," she replied. While they poured wine and whispered plans, I wiped the table and dusted the shelves. I heard them laugh about the signatures they forged. I heard them boast how no one would notice. Not even the lawyers. Gasps filled the courtroom. The spectators shifted uncomfortably. Reporters scribbled furiously. The businessman's eyes widened in shock, his lips parted. You heard that," he whispered, his voice trembling. She turned to him and nodded gently. "I did. I have kept those words in my memory because I knew one day they would matter." The judge leaned forward now, his chin resting on his hand, his eyes sharp. "Do you mean to say you witnessed conversations that proved tampering with evidence?" he asked. His tone cautious but interested, the maid nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I may not hold a law degree, but I hold memory. And memory does not lie." The opposing lawyers began to shuffle nervously. One whispered to another, "How could she know that detail?" Another hissed back, "She must be bluffing." But the sweat on their foreheads betrayed their fear. The maid's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I remember names, I remember dates. I remember the exact words one of them used," he said. "The old man will sign whatever we place before him, and the maid won't even know the difference. But I did know, I knew the papers changed. I saw one page swapped when he went to refill his glass." The businessman sat frozen, his mind spinning. He had never noticed. Never imagined the woman who quietly dusted his study would be the one to uncover what he himself had missed. He whispered to himself, "She saw what I could not." The prosecutor slammed his fist against the table, his voice sharp. "This is hearsay, nothing more. The words of a servant cannot overturn evidence." But the maid turned toward him calmly. "You call it hearsay, but I call it truth. I may have been silent, but I was present. And presence is more powerful than your polished lies." The spectators erupted in murmurs again, some nodding in agreement, others still doubting, but all listening more closely than before. The judge raised his gavel but did not strike. Instead, he asked quietly, "Can you repeat the exact words?" She nodded and repeated them clearly, her memory sharp, her tone unwavering. The weight of her recall silenced even the laughter. Reporters scribbled with excitement. "She remembers everything," one whispered. "If she is right, this changes the case," cameras clicked, capturing the moment of a maid standing taller than trained lawyers. The businessman finally found his voice. He leaned toward her and whispered with awe, "Why didn't you tell me before?" She turned her head slightly, her expression calm but heavy. "Because no one asked me. No one ever thought I had anything to say." Her words cut deeper than any evidence. The prosecutor clenched his jaw, sweat shining on his forehead. He tried to laugh. "Even if she remembers, She cannot prove it, but his laughter was hollow. The doubt had already entered the room. The judge sat back, his expression thoughtful, his eyes shifting between the maid, the businessman, and the nervous opponents. Truth may come from unlikely places, he murmured almost to himself, and sometimes the smallest voice carries the greatest weight. The maid lowered her head briefly, inhaling deeply. She had said more than she ever imagined she could, but her courage grew with every word. The laughter that once crushed her had turned into silence, into unease, into the beginning of respect. The businessman reached for her hand under the table, his touch shaking, whispering, "Thank you. Thank you for standing where everyone else left me." She squeezed his hand gently, her eyes still forward. "I will not let you fall," she whispered back. And for the first time in the trial, the opposing side shifted nervously, their arrogance cracked, their perfect confidence slipping, because they realized the servant they ignored might hold the key to their downfall. The maid's hidden knowledge had begun to surface, and though the fight was far from over, she had shown the courtroom that truth does not always belong to the powerful. Sometimes it belongs to the ones no one notices. And as the judge called for the trial to continue, the crowd leaned forward with new anticipation, because now they wanted to hear what else this quiet servant had kept hidden all these years. The courtroom that once roared with laughter now hummed with uneasy silence. The maid stood tall, her words still hanging in the air like sharp blades. The truth she had spoken cut through arrogance, and though she wore no robe or badge of law, her memory carried more power than the polished speeches of professionals. The prosecutor shuffled his papers nervously, his earlier confidence crumbling. "This is irrelevant," he barked, but his voice cracked slightly. "She is not a witness. She is not credible." Yet as he spoke, the crowd noticed the sweat shining on his forehead, the smirk gone from his face. The maid stepped closer to the defense table, her chin raised, her eyes steady. "You call me irrelevant because I am a maid," she said calmly. "But it is exactly because I am a maid that I was there, unnoticed, invisible, present in the room when you thought no one listened." Her words rang like a hammer striking the table. The businessman, who had been silent in despair, lifted his head slowly, his eyes wide with astonishment. For the first time since the trial began, hope flickered in his heart. He whispered under his breath, "She knows everything." The opposing lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. One leaned toward another, whispering sharply, "If she remembers details, it will ruin us," the other replied through clenched teeth. "Discredit her, or we lose." But their whispers carried no weight compared to the force of her voice. The judge leaned forward, his interest clear now. "Do you have more?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The maid nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." She inhaled deeply, steadying herself, then began. "I remember one night when they discussed the accounts," she said, her words deliberate. "While I poured coffee, they spoke of moving funds quietly. They said, 'He will never see the trail. The papers will cover it.' And I watched as they folded false documents into his files." The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "Lies, fabrication," he shouted. But the maid turned her eyes on him, her voice steady. "If they are lies, then explain why one page in the contract file is printed on a different paper." Slightly heavier, slightly brighter, not matching the rest, gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed. The prosecutor froze, his face drained of color. The spectators murmured louder, some pointing toward the table of evidence. The judge turned sharply. "Is this true?" he asked the opposing lawyers. One stammered, It must be coincidence." His excuse rang hollow. The maid stepped forward again, her voice gaining strength. "Coincidence does not change ink. Coincidence does not swap signatures. Coincidence does not laugh at night while plotting lies," she said, her words steady like stones dropped into water. "I was there, I heard it, and I can still hear their voices mocking him." The businessman placed his hands on the table, his voice trembling as he whispered, "They tricked me, all of them, and you saw it before I did." His eyes filled with tears, something no one had ever seen from him. Pride stripped away, gratitude rising in its place. The judge struck his gavel once, demanding quiet. But his eyes were fixed on the maid now, no longer with skepticism but with interest. "If what you say is true," he said slowly, "then this trial is not about fraud committed by the accused, but about fraud committed against him." His words sent shockwaves through the room. The prosecutor clenched his jaw, his voice desperate. "She has no right to speak. No right to accuse, but the maid answered firmly, I have every right because I was there. I was ignored, but I was present. And truth belongs to those who live it. The opposing lawyers shifted again, their papers rattling. Their confidence shattered for the first time. It was they who looked cornered. It was they who looked powerless. The tables were turning. The spectators began whispering, but their tone had changed. No longer mocking, now it was awe. She remembers everything, one said. She speaks like she belongs here, another replied. She is dismantling them piece by piece. The businessman leaned closer to her, his voice breaking softly. You are saving me. She glanced at him, her expression firm. I am saving the truth, she corrected, and he lowered his head in shame, realizing how many times he had dismissed her, never knowing she carried so much strength. The prosecutor tried one last time. Your Honor, this cannot continue. She is not trained. She is not qualified, but the judge raised his hand sharply, and yet she remembers details that trained lawyers ignored. She recalls evidence none of you presented. Perhaps you should fear not her position, but her truth. His voice carried authority. Silencing the room, the maid stood straighter, her fear melting away completely now, replaced with fire. You wanted him to fall, she said, pointing toward the opponents. But you forgot that even those at the bottom can see what the top cannot. You forgot that walls have ears, and those ears can speak when injustice grows too loud. The opponents shifted in their seats, their faces pale, their arrogance shattered. For the first time they looked exactly as the businessman once had, cornered, desperate, weak. The balance of power had shifted. The tables had turned. The crowd erupted in murmurs again, no longer with laughter, no longer with doubt. Now they spoke of her courage, her memory, her strength. She is destroying them, someone whispered. The maid is winning, another said. Reporters scribbled furiously, preparing headlines, and as the judge prepared to call the next phase of the trial, the businessman realized something he had never imagined. He had entered this room with power and pride, but his salvation had come not from wealth, not from law, but from the loyalty and courage of the one person he had overlooked. The maid sat down slowly, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, but her eyes still burned with determination. The laughter was gone, the doubt was fading, and for the first time, the courtroom began to see her not as a maid, but as a defender. The air in the courtroom was heavy, but no longer with laughter. Now it was filled with silence. Thick and tense, the maid had spoken with fire, her words cutting through the polished walls of pride. The opponents sat stiff, their papers clutched tightly, their faces pale, and the businessman leaned forward in disbelief, his eyes locked on the woman who had once only been part of the background. The judge cleared his throat, his voice steady but curious. You claim to have seen and heard details ignored by all counsel, he said. You claim documents were swapped, that signatures were forged. Do you have more? The maid nodded slowly, her hands gripping the table for strength. Yes, Your Honor, she said firmly. I remember everything. The crowd shifted uneasily. Their eyes wide, reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked. The silence was broken only by the scratching of pens and the pounding of hearts. The prosecutor tried to rise, but the judge lifted his hand. Sit down. You will speak when I allow, his tone sharp. His authority final. The maid inhaled deeply and continued, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger. I remember the night when the contracts were hidden inside folders. I remember who carried them. I remember which drawer they opened and which keys they used. And I remember one of them laughing and saying, not even the millionaire will know what's missing. Gasps echoed through the chamber. The businessman's face drained of color, he whispered. They betrayed me in my own home, his voice shaking. His chest rising fast, the maid turned her head slightly, her eyes soft. Yes, and they believed no one was listening. The prosecutor jumped to his feet. His voice desperate. Your Honor, this is impossible. She cannot remember such details she fabricates. But the judge turned his sharp gaze on him. And yet she provides specifics none of you dared to bring. Why? His question cut through the room, the prosecutor stammered. Because it is irrelevant. His excuse sounded weak even to himself. The spectators began to murmur, their voices filled with awe. She remembers every detail, one whispered. She speaks with truth, another added. She is not afraid. The maid stepped forward, her voice rising above the whispers. I may not be a lawyer, she said, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know the nights I walked silently through rooms, cleaning tables, dusting shelves while they plotted and laughed. I was invisible to them, but I was there. Always there. The opponents exchanged panicked glances. Sweat forming on their brows, one whispered sharply to the other, "She will ruin everything, stop her." But they could not. The court was no longer theirs to control. The judge leaned forward, his eyes unblinking. "Go on," he commanded. The maid's voice grew steadier. One night, one of them boasted that even the accountant could not trace the missing funds. He said the numbers were buried in false receipts. I remember the exact words he said. "It is hidden so deep. Not even a king could uncover it." She paused, her voice sharp. "But I uncovered it. Because I cleaned the very trash they left behind. I found the torn pieces of paper they thought were destroyed." The crowd erupted in gasps. Reporters leaned forward, scribbling madly. One even whispered, "This is bigger than a defense, this is an exposure." The businessman's eyes filled with tears again, his lips trembling. "You kept those pieces," he whispered. She nodded. "Yes, I kept them because truth matters. Even to a maid." The prosecutor slammed his fist on the table, his voice furious. "This is nonsense. There is no proof she kept anything." But the maid reached into her small purse, worn and faded, and pulled out folded papers. The room erupted with noise. The judge struck his gavel. "Order!" he roared. Silence fell instantly. She placed the papers on the table, her voice calm. "I kept them all these years hidden, because I knew one day they would matter." The judge leaned forward, examining them, his eyes narrowing. "These fragments match the financial reports presented," he said slowly. "But the handwriting does not. It is inconsistent." His tone carried weight, and the courtroom froze. The opposing lawyers sank lower into their seats, their confidence gone. One buried his face in his hands, another whispered curses under his breath. The spectators leaned closer, their eyes wide. The story had turned completely. The maid who was laughed at was now standing as the strongest voice in the room. The businessman lowered his face into his hands, tears slipping through his fingers. His voice breaking, "I was blind, I trusted the wrong people. And only she saw the truth." His words echoed softly. Many in the crowd felt their hearts stir, pity and admiration mixing. The judge placed the fragments aside carefully, his gaze returning to the maid. "You may continue at the next session," he said firmly. "This evidence will be preserved then." Turning his sharp eyes to the prosecution, he added, "And the court will question why these details were not presented before." His words landed like thunder. The prosecutors lowered their heads. Shame, the crowd erupted in murmurs again, but this time not of laughter, this time not of doubt. Now it was awe, now it was respect, reporters whispered. Tomorrow's headline writes itself, "The maid who defended the millionaire." The businessman reached out, his hand shaking, resting gently on hers, his voice hoarse. "You are saving me. You are saving everything." She looked at him with quiet strength. "No, senor," she whispered. "I am saving the truth. The rest is yours to decide." And so in a courtroom that once mocked her, she stood as a defender no one expected. Her voice had silenced arrogance. Her memory had shaken lies, and her evidence had stunned the entire court. The maid had turned the tables completely, and now, the outcome of the trial no longer looked certain. The courtroom doors creaked as the final session began. The air was heavy with tension. Everyone knew that today would decide everything. The businessman sat quietly at the defense table, his once proud shoulders hunched but his eyes fixed firmly on the woman beside him, the maid who had stood when no one else dared. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras ready, their pens scribbling notes even before the judge entered. Whispers filled the chamber. "The maid has evidence," one voice said. "She turned the case upside down," another added. Even the opponents looked restless, their confidence gone, their smiles replaced with nervous glances. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. His gavel struck, echoing like thunder. "We will continue," he declared, his tone sharper than before. "And I remind all present, this court seeks truth, not pride, not wealth, not appearances." His eyes lingered on the maid as if acknowledging her courage. The prosecutor rose, his voice trembling slightly. "Your Honor, with respect, this woman is not a lawyer. Her testimony cannot outweigh the law." But before he could continue, the judge cut him off. "And yet she presented evidence you failed to bring. Evidence that aligns with the inconsistencies we now see. Perhaps the law has been served better by her honesty than by your silence." His words carried heavy weight. Silencing the protest, the maid stood slowly, her hands gripping her worn purse, her heart racing, but her voice steady. "Your Honor, I am not here for honor. I am not here for glory. I am here because I could not watch truth be buried. I may be a servant, but I serve not only with my hands. I serve with my ears, with my eyes, with my memory. And today I serve with my voice. The spectators leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her. The laughter that once filled the chamber was gone, replaced by quiet respect. Even those who had mocked her now listened with admiration. She unfolded the last of the fragments she had saved, placing them gently before the judge. "These are the missing pieces," she said, her words soft but firm. "I found them in the trash. I kept them because I knew one day they would matter. They show names, dates, and amounts that do not match. They show lies hidden behind numbers." The judge examined them carefully, his brows furrowing. Then he looked sharply at the opposing lawyers. "Do you deny these?" he asked, his tone like steel. The lawyers shifted nervously. One stammered, We cannot confirm." The other bowed his head. Silence was their only answer, and silence was heavier than any denial. Gasps spread through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled faster. Cameras clicked furiously. The truth was no longer hidden, it stood bare before everyone. The maid had brought it into the light. The businessman lowered his face into his hands, his shoulders shaking, not with shame this time, but with relief. He whispered softly, "I am free," his voice breaking, tears slipping through his fingers. The maid placed a gentle hand on his arm, whispering, "You are not free because of me. You are free because the truth could not be silenced." The judge struck his gavel, his voice firm. "This court finds that the evidence against the accused has been compromised. The case is dismissed." His words rang through the chamber. The courtroom erupted. Some clapped, others gasped. Reporters shouted into phones, "The maid has won. She has saved him." The businessman stood slowly, his legs weak. He turned to the maid, his eyes wet, his voice trembling. "You have done what no one else could. Not my lawyer, not my wealth, not my power. You saved me." He bowed his head to her, shocking everyone, a millionaire bowing to his maid. The crowd erupted again, whispers spreading. He bows to her. The servant became the savior. Cameras captured the moment, an image that would soon circle the world. Outside the courthouse, journalists crowded around her. Microphones thrust forward, voices shouting questions. "How did you remember so much? Why did you defend him? What will you do now?" She looked overwhelmed, but she answered simply, her voice soft. "I only did what was right. I only spoke what I saw. I only defended truth. Nothing more." The businessman stood beside her, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder. "From this day forward, she is not my servant. She is my partner. She has earned a place no money can buy, a place of honor and respect." His voice carried strength. The crowd cheered, reporters scribbled even faster. Her fellow employees, who had once whispered in doubt, now looked at her with awe. Some cried, some clapped, one whispered, "She gave us all a voice, And in their eyes she was no longer invisible. She was a leader. The story spread across newspapers, television, and radios. The maid who defended the millionaire, servant turned savior, truth spoken from the shadows. Her name became known beyond the walls of the mansion where she once worked silently. At home, when she returned that night, she sat quietly with her family, her children's eyes wide. "Mama, you are famous," they whispered. She smiled gently, hugging them tightly. "No, hijos, I'm not famous. I only spoke when silence was no longer enough." The businessman visited her home days later, not in pride but in humility. He sat at her simple table, his voice soft. "You saved more than me. You saved my soul. You showed me what I had forgotten, that loyalty, honesty, and courage cannot be bought. They must be earned." He promised her a new role, not as a maid but as a trusted advisor in his business. Her eyes filled with tears. She accepted not for glory but for dignity. The courtroom that once laughed at her had become the stage of her victory. The man who once towered above her now stood beside her as equal, and the world that once ignored her now remembered her as the woman who defended truth. It was not money that saved the millionaire. It was not power, it was not law. It was the voice of a maid, the voice no one expected, the voice that turned doubt into respect. And so a new respect began, not just for her, but for all voices once silenced, proving to the world that sometimes the smallest person carries the greatest truth. Smallest person carries the greatest truth.